Runabout, 1910, as remembered by James Crooks. My first car was an old Maxwell Runabout. 2 cylinders, no top on it, made by the Maxwell people. It had a wooden transmission. This fellow by the name of Glenn from over at Corsica had bought this car from a fellow from over in beyond Brookville that had drove it into Corsica and got it into the mud. He had tied ropes around the tires to get it out, but he couldn't, so he sold it to Glenn. I don't know how Glenn got to hear that I wanted a car, but he came over to Clarion to sell it to me, and he came into the store where I was working. I wanted a car, but I was ashamed to deal with anybody in Clarion because that was a crazy idea back then, to have a car. But I still wanted one. I liked anything that had wheels on it, even a wheelbarrow. So Glenn and I started dealing. The car was sitting out in front of the store, and I would get a customer, leave, and come back, and we'd deal some more. After a while, he said he'd let me have it for $150, but I told him that $125 was my limit. So he dealt and dealt and dealt some more. Now, back in those days, the train was the only way to get back and forth to Corsica if you didn't have a horse and buggy, and pretty soon he either had to take his car back home or sell it to me so he could catch the train. He had to do something. So finally he said, "All right, $125. I hadn't even sat in the car yet, because I was ashamed to go out on Main Street and do it. So, as I was about to give him his money, I asked him how you started it. "Well, there's a little pin in there," he said. "You turn it halfway, then put the crank in at the front and crank it." So I gave him the money, and he started out on a dead run for the train. He got out past the car, then all of a sudden he turned and came back, opened the door and threw me a pair of pinchers, pliers, you know, and he said, "That goes with it." And he made another dash out. But then he turned and came back a second time and threw a screwdriver to me and said, "That goes with it too." Then he ran to catch the train. Well, I waited until everybody got off the street. Then I went out and looked up and down, and I couldn't see anybody, so I turned the knob and cranked it, and the darn thing started. I thought I'd drive up past the courthouse to where the old cigar factory was, at 3rd and Main, and turn there and come back on Wood Street. I got up just about to the factory when there was Bobby Saylor, who worked for us in the store, and he yelled, "Where the H did you get that car? Whose car is that?" "It's mine," I said. "Give me a ride." I said, "You can have a ride if you can catch me. I don't know how to stop her." I lifted up in the gas, and he ran and got in, and I took him around the block. Then he jumped out, and I headed back towards 5th Avenue. I lived down the hill on 5th at that time and didn't know how to stop the car. I didn't know nothing about the darn thing. It was running and I was driving, and that was all I did know. Anyway, I figured I'd run to the top of that hill, then I'd turn the button off and drift down to my house. So that's what I did, and I stopped right in front of the house. My wife, Anna, came out and asked, "Whose car's that?" I said, "That's my car." She said, "Well, you're crazy." I said, "Well, I know I'm crazy, but that's my car." I didn't know what to do with the car, but Teddy Knapp next door had a barn, and I went to see Teddy, and he let me run the car into his barn. For the next week, all day I'd think about my car, and every evening I'd come home from work, put on my old clothes, and go down and figure where everything in the car went and what it did. By Sunday, I thought I had pretty well figured it out. Sunday afternoon, I got into my good clothes and was leaving the house when Anna asked, "Are you going to church?" I said, "No, I'm not going to church." She said, "So what are you going to do?" I said, "I'm going to take that car for a drive, for a ride." She said, "Where are you going?" I said, "Oh, I don't know. Maybe I'll take her down to your home." Anna had been over from down below Reedsburg, and I figured that would be a good run. "Well, I'll go too," she said. "No," I said. "I don't want to kill you. I don't know anything about driving that car." She laughed and said, "We'll both die together then." So we started, all dressed up in our Sunday clothes. The car had a windshield, but no windows on the side and no roof. We did all right through Reedsburg, but then it started to rain, and we slid into a ditch. I got out in my good shoes with my good clothes on in the rain and cranked the car. And Anna got out her umbrella and held it up, but she was still getting wet because the seats were made of leather, and the water was running down them to where she was sitting. I was cranking, and nothing happened. So I said, "Let's walk over to John Over's." She said, "Oh, you can start it. You can start it." And so I kept working on that thing, but she wouldn't start, so we walked over to John Over's. He had a team of mules, and after he fed us our dinner, we hitched the mules up and pulled the car back over to his place. John was a great kidder, and I don't know why he didn't kid me about the car, but he never did. Once it was in his shed, he just hitched up his horse and buggy and brought us back home to Clarion. So the car was down at John's, and all that next week I kept thinking and thinking about why she wouldn't start. Finally, I thought I'd figured out what was wrong with it, that the wire had come off one of the spark plugs. So the weekend came again, and I hitched a ride down to Over's, and I went in the shed and lifted up the hood, and sure enough, that's what it was. So I put the wire back on, started it up, and drove the darn thing home. It worked all right. Well, all right as far as it ever did. I used to carry a thick plank of wood with me. It had a handle on it. When I came to a steep hill, I'd run up it as far as I could, and the car would stop. Then I'd set the brakes and sit there a while to see if the brakes would hold. If they did, I'd get this piece of plank and I'd put it against the wheel. Then I'd get in the car and ease it back on that, so it wouldn't drift back any more. Then I'd go around and crank the car, get back in, and race the motor like the devil and go as far as I could. Then I'd walk back and get the plank. That's the way I got up some of those hills. I remember one time I was taking Daddy over, my father-in-law, for a ride, and we got down towards 5 Point. After the big turn down there's a little downhill, and then there's a level place, so the car would run along pretty good down toward the county home. Well, we got to going about 20 miles an hour, and that was too fast for Daddy, and he said he was going to jump out. I said, "Don't you jump. You'll get hurt. Don't you jump." And I grabbed his coat with one hand while I was trying to steer with the other. I hung on to both him and the wheel until I could get the car stopped, and then I went slower after that. The car was worn out when I got it, but I used it to sell hats all over the county. You had to be a master mechanic to keep it on the road, though, and I finally decided to sell the doggone thing. Over in Knox there was a pretty good dealer named Jim Runyon, and I took Daddy over, and we went over there. Daddy wanted a horse, and this fella sold horses and everything else. So he got there, and I went in, and I saw Runyon looking at my little car, and I said, "Jim, do you want to buy a good car, or do you have anything you'll trade for it?" He looked at the car a little bit, then said, "That horse back there in the second stall, take a look at that." So Daddy and I went back to see this horse, and it had been a race horse, and it was spoiled, but I didn't know that, and Daddy didn't know that, but Daddy liked a wild horse anyhow. I said, "Daddy, will you give me $50 for this horse?" Daddy said, "I'll give you 75. I said, "I don't want 75, I want 50. Daddy said, "Well, all right, yes, I will." So I went back to talk to Jim, and Jim wasn't feeling very good. He was sitting on a nail keg in the livery barn, and I said, "Well, Jim, if you've got $100, I'd like to trade." All he said was, "Huh?" So I said, "Well, I'm a good dealer. How about $50? Jim said, "No." Finally, I got down to $10, and he still said no, so I said, "How do you want to deal?" "Even Steven," he said, and so I said, "You got a deal." He wouldn't give us harness or a buggy to take the horse away, and we had a terrible time before we got it back to Daddy's place. But he grew to love that horse, so I guess I made a pretty good deal that day. Anyway, that was the last I saw of my little Maxwell Runabout.